Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually looks at geopolitics in the round. Today's episode is part 2 of an episode that I started last week.
So what's quite bizarre is that through the chronology of their accounting, over the course of maybe a decade, they would swap the loans, they would swap the asset of the loan books between similarly named companies. And what was also interesting in, going through reams and reams and reams of companies' house reporting and was that then I had to actually go international, because a lot of these companies had switch company entities that were based in the Isle of Man or based in Malta. It became detective work, essentially. There is one company in the middle of all of this that appointed whose director appointed himself 32 million shares at the value of £1 each to add up to the debt that was being switched across. So to add up to the value of the debt. So it all got really, really interesting. And, Carlton, you obviously know that Malta's long positioned itself as an international, financial services jurisdiction.
As your first country, which you mentioned,
as the Isle of Man,
which is a crown protectorate of the United Kingdom. But carry on.
Yeah, so it doesn't imply wrongdoing per se, but it struck me as unusual that these companies would have a London address, an Isle of Man address, and a registered entity in Malta. It's fascinating.
Look, let's be realistic. Both are ex-colonial. Well, one still is. The other one's an ex-colonial possession of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, as a monetary system in the city, has at least since the 18th to 19th century always made it difficult to follow the procedures. And indeed, there's still a law, I believe, I think it's still in place. In fact, I'm pretty much sure it's still in place, that above the 6th floor in the city, a premises can be outside of the United Kingdom. So a lot of the banking systems work above that. They may well be in the Caymans or in the Isle of Man or in Malta or wherever, right? Because you just say they are. And the city regulations going back forever in a day because of an imperial system have allowed that. So it's a murky world is what I'm trying to say to you. Now, my question would be, did you give these companies the right to speak, or did you speak to any representative of these companies in order to try and understand what their position was?
Yes, absolutely we did. With any piece of journalism in this sphere, for listeners' benefit, everybody's entitled to a right to review. which doesn't mean that you can't publish your opinion. What it means is that you have an obligation to contact anybody that's going to be named in the article and let them know that they're going to be contacted, that they're going to be named in the article, and they have a right to comments. Now, we did actually get some very we did actually get comments from some of these organisations, and other organisations declined to comment. But in terms of the due diligence, we did contact every company that was named. I am actually interviewing one of the former CEOs of one of the companies on Friday, so I will be able to report back. But just in terms of legitimate journalism, that's absolutely something that we would always do. Just as you, Carlton, would contact anyone that was named in a criminal investigation.
Absolutely, an investigation. Absolutely goes without saying. I mean, this is just interesting. I mean, just my interest on that, because I would imagine that the position was that they actually acted totally and utterly within the law and the structures of the law, and loaned people within the terms of the loan, which were agreed by the individuals who signed the loan, and that HMRC, in its wisdom, has not felt it necessary to look at their angle of the loan. And quite rightly, as they would say, in their eyes, HMRC says this is a position that the civil court, I guess even the High Court of the civil bench, would be the body that would look at this and pronounce some position on it if somebody actually brought it to that position. And that's the big question. Is anybody going to bring it to that? Because actually, if you've got little money, it's probably going to cost you a hell of a lot of money to get some sort of recognition. And I think, Bowie, that's one of the areas that you're sort of alluding to, that the HMRC said, not my job, Governor, and this is up to the court. And if nobody files to the court, then there is no position. Am I right?
Well, I think actually, sorry, I'm just going to jump in quickly, Carlton, and then I'll let Bowie answer the question. But in 2024, Rachel Reeves did commission this guy called Ray McCann to look into this, and so their position was actually, I mean, the government kind of accepted many of the McCann report recommendations, and it was paradoxical, so HMRC was kind of saying, like, look, we want this, we actually want to bring this to a close, but in order to bring it to a close, these individuals need to take this to court and settle. But yet these private companies continue recalling the loans, and because the private companies are based in Malta or the Isle of Man or whatever, then they're kind of out of the jurisdiction anyway. So yeah, sorry to jump in, and I'll let Bowie actually answer the question that was asked.
Yeah, so interesting you touch upon the McCann report. So that it actually came out with that there were conflicts of interest with it, and that the government knew about it. One being that he previously worked for HMRC. Another one was that he already had public comments on this whole policy loan charge, and that he was also a public supporter of Labour. So when the government investigated it, I wouldn't say that they gave it everything on this. It was more so they felt potentially like they had to do something and just did the bare minimum, so to speak, on it. But my question, and the question to your listeners as well when it comes to this whole situation, is that you pay tax to the HMRC, which is essentially the government of the United Kingdom. You pay tax in exchange for protection in the form of the military, public services, all this sort of stuff. But in terms of the tax that you pay, it should protect you as a citizen. And when HMRC themselves, through acknowledging that you owe tax on it, are saying this is a form of income, and then turning around and sidestepping when it comes to this and saying, oh, you need to take it to court at your own expense. I think that's a bit of a failure of the state in a way. and it comes across really just hypocritical that they hold your hand and help you pay what's owed to them in a way, but then completely paradoxically and essentially stepping over what HMRC brought from you, you're then having to pay back the loan. It makes no sense.
Boy, I stand with you, my friend, on that. But the problem is that if you're in HMRC, and definitely if you're at the top of HMRC, there is zero um, interest in you actually tackling what could or could not have been a badly drafted law by the executive, i.e., the government, and then covered by the legislature and brought into existence by Parliament. So, my point would be that the political position of Rachel Reeves would have been a civil servant, yeah, probably not a SPAD, a special advisor, but a civil servant coming to him saying, this could be the next big problem. We need to get ahead of this. And by the way, just guesswork, so nobody can say anything, just guesswork, that, we probably need to get ahead of this. So let's look into it and let's see if this is problematic, taking into account that citizens have lost their lives over it in whatever format, be it that they've taken their own lives or whatever, or they've been so ill that this has happened, or whatever the case might be. And we don't want to be looking in 5 years' time. Well, actually, they won't probably be bothered about 10 years' time because it might not be them in power. But anyway, we don't want to be looking at in future and have a COVID type case or a Grenville type case or whatever it might be. So let's get ahead of it. Let's look at this. Now, the degree to which they want to look at it fully, I can only leave to you, Bowie and Furgs, who've looked into the situation because I'm coming to it new. But I would say politically, it's something which they picked up on quite relatively quickly when it started getting some heat, and your story may even add heat to it. And basically then just say, well, we've done our bit. And HMRC are squeaky clean too, because it isn't their role to seek reparations for individuals who have paid their taxes and to the state, but have been found foul in some other format. It's nothing to do with the criminal law, so it's nothing to do with the police. It's a civil law kind of situation. And everybody knows that that's extremely murky, particularly when it comes to finances. I mean, the only body that I could even consider to think anything about it would be the SFO, Serious Fraud Office. But again, where's the allegation of fraud?
That's what's really complicated with all of this, and that's why we're trying to drive awareness to this topic. It's a very engaged topic at the moment in our forums and on different forums regarding contracting, but there are very few publications actually getting into this, and our goal is to drive as much awareness as we possibly can for it, and for everyone to question this whole situation. I mean, not even just people involved, just everyone in general going, what if that was me? Because it
Yeah,
could have been anyone if they were working.
absolutely.
And
Sorry,
And,
Boy, absolutely. Totally agree.
and,
Absolutely.
and Carlton, you know how I do love to, stand on a soapbox and bang the drum, but this is a huge problem. This affects so many individuals, and so many, aside from the tragic loss of human life, the current human mental health concerns and sort of and trauma that this is bringing to, as I say, like thousands of contractors. Thousands of people were affected by this, so much so that, as I say, when to circle back, when I was originally briefed on this, I didn't even know that my stepdad was actually being persecuted
Yeah.
by these loan companies. It seems like, we could. I think, I know we all talk about the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever. But I think that anybody who starts actually understanding this and asks questions and talks to people and says, actually, were you, did this affect you? Did and so many, the level of emotions on the human angle aren't just the kind of exhaustion and the stress of having to deal with all of these things. It's there's a layer of, well, I trusted my employer, I trusted them at the time. I entered into this scheme because my boss was a nice guy, I
But
trusted
Fergus, that
him.
wasn't an employer, was it?
No,
If
no,
I'm
but
misunderstanding it, it wasn't an employer. That's
no.
the
I'm
whole
not talking
benefit
about.
of the
I'm not
process.
talking, Colton. I'm not talking about the umbrella companies, but I'm talking about at the point when they got that contract, with the NHS or with
Mhm.
British Gas or with etc. Like that there were, these were big companies. These
Sure.
weren't small companies or sort of at the point when they were hired, and the HR team said, well, yes, okay, but you need to do this, this, and this. Well, they trusted them. And so, a lot of the emotions that I'm hearing now are, well, I was told this, I was told this, I trusted this and this, So it's not just simply, debt, which, as we know, is destroys people. It's the sort of false narrative that they lived through during the time of their employment, because they kind of had a level of trust and belief, and now they sort of feel like, well, that bubble in my life kind of massively let me down. And
Fergus, don't misunderstand me. I'm totally, utterly, 100% on board with what you're saying, and I can see how it happens. And the reason why I just said, but they weren't the boss, is because they're coming at it as a separate entity pushing into the NHS, into British Gas, into whatever it might be, right? And the reason why they're being hired by many of these companies, oftentimes, not always, is because they don't need to pay them holiday pay, they don't need to pay them sick pay, they don't need to pay them whatever it might be, right? So you've got this little foreign body that you're bringing into you to provide you with specialists, oftentimes specialist skills, specialist capability, specialist tools, but and this is the big one, they have to comply with our systems, and that's what you're saying, Fergs. They have to comply with our systems, but actually they're not part of us, so we're not responsible for them. That's again something that I find. I don't know what you think on this, Bowie. I find that also problematic that more and more companies do that. Don't get me wrong. Well, if it works, it's great for the company, for the contractor, and for the company. But when it doesn't work, they can just throw you away. And that is the negative of this type of system.
yeah,
And what I wanted
and
to ask also is,
oh,
sorry, folks, both you and Bowie, going forward now, is this still effective? Is this scheme working in some format, in some way, shape, or means? Government has this massive preponderance for legacy companies. I can speak to this personally. We've got tech in terms of electronic monitoring that nobody has in the United Kingdom, far in advance of, and you know this, Fergs, far in advance of what we're using in the United Kingdom. And indeed, what we're using in the United Kingdom doesn't work 9 times out of 10, and they can't put the monitors on individuals. But they use the legacy company because it's already tied to the system. So my question is to you on this one, Bowie, is using your magazine hat on. How often do you see this that that smaller companies can't get in where the legacy company already is and is doing actually a very bad job? And is this or was this one of the drivers as to why people signed up? Because they sign anything to get their product in because they know it's better. So there's two questions there.
Well, it's interesting with umbrella companies in general. So the IR35 legislation introduced by the government essentially mandated the creation of these companies. The government is wholly responsible for the formation of these companies being a thing in the first place and people working through these third parties, so to speak, in order to get paid for a company. And then a company may take on a contractor, as you point out, because there obviously there's no day one sick pay, all of this sort of stuff that comes with a permanent employee, and you can take someone on for a shorter period of time. But it's the government's situation where they've caused these umbrella companies to come up just so they could eke out a little bit of tax, well, I would say allegedly from all of this. And it's it's really bizarre, and that's why I find this so confusing that the government is staying completely out of
Mm,
this situation.
mm.
It's quite interesting just to see.
Well, disingenuous, really, in terms of that they've created this process and now step away from it. But then that's what you're doing when you're employing contractors, isn't it?
It
But
depends. So if
the
you're
second
hiring,
question of you, Bowie, was, and Fergus, to be fair, was where are we now? What's the situation now?
so new legislation came in a couple of months ago called the joint and several liability legislation, which seeks to essentially audit these companies more and to take down any bad actors in this industry as a whole. Because even if the loan charge situation doesn't exist, there are still umbrella companies that are trying to find smaller ones who are trying to find ways of eking out more profit essentially from contractors. So there's legislation seeming to get rid of that and push contractors towards bigger companies. You could say that's a fix in of itself, but then at the same time, with all the bureaucratic paperwork, it's meaning that a lot of smaller umbrella companies are having to shut down and contractors having to go to bigger ones. And it's leading to an interesting situation. And I think you'll find this quite interesting, Carlton, that now a lot of companies, when you go and work for them, they will tell you what umbrella company to use. You don't get a choice, or they will say, here's a list of three, choose one of them.
Right.
So
So
there's a
if
lot
And
of regulation.
sorry, so I'm just going to say, so if the problem occurs again, it will have been at the making of the umbrella company that's taking, well, the fixed company. It will have been at their making because they're suggesting to you the umbrella company. But I can also see that there's still zero protection again against a similar thing happening in a different format. Am I right?
Sure. So the umbrella companies, a lot of the bigger ones are really nice companies and they do everything by the book and everything right. But even with all of this legislation by the government, it does not hypothetically stop bad actors from getting in on not this scheme, but different schemes that have not potentially been discovered yet. Because these companies operate on so little margins that in order to stay afloat, they're either huge, very efficient, or they do something like this.
Hmm. Hmm.
just circling back, because obviously, we don't judge our listeners, but if any of our listeners work in a situation, or would like to talk to me about, if any of our listeners work in work for a company that signposts contractors towards any of these umbrella companies, I would love to talk to you. So please, obviously do reach out. I would, I this is a mystery that we are sort of unraveling. This is a very, very complex situation. This is very complex kind of
Area of
problem
tax law.
problem that's affecting so many people. And before any more human lives are destroyed by this, as Bowie says, like, he's taking the lead on this, and is the only publication that's actually doing something worthwhile um by not only capturing the voices of those affected and trying to explain what's actually happening, but also trying to help those involved moving forwards in ways that unfortunately other people have not, because the the third element to this, Carlton, which you won't believe. I mean, this is like, if for listeners, if this doesn't already resonate with you as the most horrific thing you've ever heard, there's then a law firm called Elysium who kind of stepped in and said, "Hey, everybody, we can represent you. You've all been told by the government. Yeah, you've all been told by the government that you need to settle in court. Well, hey, happy days, we'll represent you." And so what they've kind of done is they've created this sort of one size fits all litigation package. So it's like a sort of, they're essentially inviting everybody to join the same course of litigation. So they're asking everybody to sort of buy into this, to their scheme, to kind of buy into the same the same level of representation, and then essentially saying that, well, if we're going to take if we're going to go to court once, we might as well go to court 600 times, but we're going to do it all at the same time. So then these contractors are sort of being, that they're like, that there's a rabbit in the headlights moment when you're kind of thinking, well, all right, these people clearly understand. They are reaching out to me. Do I go in for this? Like other people are going in for this. Other people are saying that they're doing it. So yeah, I mean, as I say, if you weren't already thinking, this is, this is such an unbelievable, unspoken car crash, well, it gets worse.
So the reason why I laughed or sniggered, whichever word you want to choose, was because this sounds like an American class action, doesn't it? Whereby they say, okay, we will deal with it all on your behalf, blah, 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 pay us whatever it might be, or no win, no fee, or whatever the case may be. And we'll take this because we think we're going to win the case. And in the small print somewhere, states that if we actually don't win and we lose, and the court costs are whatever, that you, in signing up, sign to pay those costs. And you pay the lawyer's costs, etc., etc., etc. So please, Bowie, come in, because can you explain to people how dangerous some of these class actions are?
Well, we're obviously not alleging anything against Elysian.
No, exactly. Let me make that clear.
And we do believe that they are helping contractors, but the situation is quite difficult in the way that a class action suit, as you say in the States, which seems like it's very similar to, is typically against one company, and it gathers a whole bunch of individuals and they go against that company, think like a gas leak or something which has affected lots of different people, their health or whatnot. But for this, it's a lot of people going through a lot of different companies operating a similar sort of scheme. And as Ferguson says with this, or as Fergus says, sorry, with this, it's a situation where it's not one size fits all, and it's a very, very complicated situation. And a lot of contractors are in very different situations and require a lot of personal support. So while we think they're a great company for taking this on, it's a situation where it's almost like contractors should see what options they've got available and see which direction they want to go to. Because for a class action, they are also typically very slow to update people on the progress and what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And for people where their entire salary or over their entire salary essentially is at stake, including interest, it's something where people need to be constantly updated and constantly informed by anything.
Yeah.
So as I say, no, we've got nothing against them whatsoever. It's just a situation where everyone needs to look at their situation independently and come to the right judgment call, whether they seek their own legal representation, whether they want to see how this plays out before they act, or whether they want to join this quote unquote class action lawsuit.
And also be aware of all of the small print that goes with it, because I think it's the vehicle one that's recently had a problem whereby everybody said, piling on your vehicle on the, well, it's not allegedly, VW were manipulating the gas, the levels of mileage that you would get utilizing diesel by putting a particulate in the system. Now, apparently, something's come down saying, yeah, VW, great, but we're not so sure whether all the other companies, Mercedes, Citroen, blah, 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 that people jumped in on. And then, so the small print now is questionable as to who pays for all of the other companies, because obviously they put lawyers up, very, very expensive lawyers in the High Court. And so if it's not going anywhere, who actually pays for that? It
Well,
was
it's
a no
funny.
win, no fee thing to start off with, you see.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the VW situation to start with, because I implore your viewers to read into that. Because who caught them in the end? It wasn't some environmental agency, it wasn't some big company that caught them. It was a university running a study, and they didn't
Yes.
have the budget to actually buy the standardized rolling roads and everything they use. And it turned out that VW had installed a system so the cars could detect when they were on one of these rolling roads and modify their emissions. It's a bizarre case.
Yeah.
And in a way, it wasn't even a publication. It was a very small group of people that exposed something massive. And at CUK with this, we want to, in a way, do something very similar and just expose this to as many people as we possibly can, this whole loan charge recall situation. While also, I want to also bring people back to the loan charge situation in general with HMRC and go, well, hold on a second. If I didn't know that I was signing up to this scheme, a lot of contractors who've reached out to us say that they didn't, and they actually went through a third party who they weren't even aware existed. Where is the case in it? That's my question with it. And I believe that this is something a lot bigger than just talking about these loans. I believe what we will uncover will go into everything regarding the situation.
Well, you just answered the question that I was going to put to you as we come towards the end of the show. Why have you jumped into it as the editor? That was going to be my question. And you've just sort of usurped the position. But can you go a little bit deeper into that? Why is your company magazine looking at it at this length? Have you been inundated with individuals who are contractors? Because you're a contractor UK, so have contractors come to you and said, "Hey, this is what has happened to me and to a lot of my friends and colleagues." Why? Why did you start it? Why did you bring that hound dog Fergs into the situation to start looking at it?
It's a really weird situation that has been ongoing for a very long time with HMRC at the beginning, obviously bringing all the money back and people still settling with payment plans and all these sorts of things going on until now. But what brought me into it was just seeing, so on our forum, people started talking about this as they received all the letters in. And I just started reading it and I couldn't understand any of it. It is not because I'm not well versed in obviously the community or anything, but because it is so ludicrous that it just doesn't make any sense. And all these people, the more and more I read into it, they're saying the same thing. A lot of people too are fighting back so hard that it's not a lot of people aren't stepping back and going and looking at this and going, what even is this whole situation? And we had a contractor who reached out to Furgas actually recently talking about all of this. And the contractor signed up with a perfectly legitimate umbrella company, which then subbed it out to another offshore company which was doing this scheme. So this contractor who had to pay back HMRC didn't even know about this situation. So it wasn't someone who saw a piece of paper that said this is what's going on. It was someone that had a whole bunch of stuff put in front of them and was just told, sign it, you'll start your contract, and didn't have a clue and is being come after. So that's where we're going with this. And my involvement just stems from the fact that it is completely nonsensical. It is
I think
ridiculous, and I am astonished that the main media, isn't really talking about this because I would go as far to say, a scandal.
yeah, I mean, I think so. So look, there's a legal term which is unconscionable bargain. So an unconscionable bargain means a contract that's so unfair, or so complicated that a reasonable person who was properly informed and acting freely would not knowingly enter into it. Right. So essentially, like, what it means is that if the person that was signing this at the time, so if we go back to point A of this, of the endeavors of the contractor, if they had genuinely understood what they were signing into and had a crystal ball to look forward to the future in terms of how this might then play out and what what the risks might be and what the implications might be, they would never have signed it. But like I say, that's the legal term for it. What I find so what I find humbling and fascinating in equal terms is that so many of these contractors who are sort of taking every day at a time and fighting the good fight have saved every bit of correspondence. They've saved every letter, they've saved every email, they've saved every. I mean, actually, some of these companies were coming after them via WhatsApp, which is again interesting. And so they were able to share reams of evidence. I mean, decades of evidence, and so as a journalist, this is great. I would say that in general, advice would be please do save everything, because you never know when you might need it, as it were. But when you think about the mental health impact and you think about, gosh, that's the equivalent of keeping every whole message from your ex-partner that you broke up with 10 years ago and keeping all of those messages in a file because you know that you have to, and still not actually understanding what happened. So whilst they've got all of this correspondence and we've got all of this correspondence, and we've kind of gone through it with journalistic eyes, editorial eyes, forensic eyes, and there are still so many unanswered questions.
Well, I think the point that Bowie made in the beginning to this last part of the program was, and that you made, Ferg, was that how can you be guilty for something you don't know what it is? Now, there's two bits of the law, though. One says that ignorance is no defence, but that's not true, because even in the criminal law, there's the guilty deed and the guilty act, mens rea and actus reus. So you have to have the mens rea, the guilty deed, the guilty thought, the guilty process that you're going to do something, and then you need to do the guilty act, actus reus. So, and in civil law is actually round about the same. You cannot have, and I think it says in the original statutes, an idiot, because that had a legal definition, sign something which allows for them then to be guilty of something, because they can't understand. So in both of those cases, we do go right back to the beginning. If you don't understand, how can you sign? And that's why it obviously becomes a position for the court to make a decision. And I guess the court's position would have been, would a normal, everyday, sane individual have understood what they were signing up to? I guess that's what any judge, if this goes, would look to. Were you aware? Which is why I asked right in the beginning, who's at fault? Were they doing it, the majority, because they wanted to, in some way, shape or means, evade tax? That was the big question. And I guess that will be the legal question at the end. Well, listen, it's been a fascinating show. Bowie, can we have you back again at some stage in the future?
Of course, I had a great time. I'd really appreciate it.
That's super. And I'd like for you to finish off before Fergus comes with kind of your understanding of what you're bringing to light in your company and why, so that the public can have a greater understanding of yourself and the checks in the post, I hope. That's my joke, ladies and gentlemen. But yeah, if you could just give them an understanding about what you're trying to do with your magazine, and Fergs, if you could then also end your position. This will be a two-parter because I'm looking at the timings now, and it's too long for half. So this will be the end of part two for listeners, and obviously I'll do something on part one to bring that to an end. So. Thanks very much. And Boy, if I could first ask you just to explain where you sit.
Of course. So, for me in general, as I explained beforehand when I got brought into this, it was an unraveling story. It was going on the forum, seeing people discussing this, seeing people first getting letters, a few people, and then more and more and more people got brought into it. And it became something so big in a way in this industry. And so few people were talking about it and actually mentioning who was behind it, why they were doing this, and how these loans were actually structured. And that's where we are trying to get a bit of a difference. We're trying to jump up and down, bring awareness to this, and bring about just how ludicrous this whole situation is. There are a whole bunch of different unorthodox ways to get around paying tax. For example, a company director can put a car, he can go buy a Mercedes, put the Mercedes through the company, and then depreciate the car through the company. That is obviously a situation where if someone got caught, hands up, they pay what's owed, they pay any penalties. This situation isn't that. This is a situation where it's someone's livelihood. It's someone who signed into something a lot of the time completely unaware of what they were actually signing into and what it actually entailed. And with people, it was sort of a double-edged, so it was a double whammy. So they first had HMRC come after them, which did result in 10 people losing their lives and a lot of mental health anguish that came afterwards. And in a way, for a lot of people, it was all over after that. It was all quiet. It was the eye of the storm. And now this situation's coming up, and it is much worse than the HMRC one, and it is annoyingly in a civil court, so to speak, as opposed to it being the government, and the government are stepping back from it. So my purpose through Contractor UK and through bringing awareness to this is just to get as many eyes as possible on this, to talk to, get everyone looking at this, get everyone thinking, what if that was me? What are these people going through? And to bring into question whether these loans are actually enforceable. Because whatever a judge says in courts, whether they are or they're not, I don't believe is the public consensus. I believe it's on an individual basis, and I believe it's something a lot bigger than our publication, and it's something that extends to many, many people.
Yes, and from my side, I mean, like, look, to echo to echo what you just said, I mean, look, let's just encourage conversation. If thousands of ordinary contractors believed they were being paid a salary, but yet years later discovered those payments were illegally characterized as repayable loans, was there ever truly informed consent? And I would just I hope that listeners, I very much doubt that the majority of listeners will will have heard of the loan charge recall. But unfortunately, I know that many will. And one of the things that has become increasingly poignant to me is that people feel the need to suffer in silence. And that's the last thing that I would wish. So I would encourage people to gravitate towards the Contractor UK forum, and we can post the link on the podcast notes. And even if you don't wish to post, just read what's there, read other people's stories, and if that identifies with you, or if you've got a story to share, or if you know someone that has, or whatever, first and foremost, look after yourselves and look after that person. But secondly, if you want to reach out to us, if you want to make contact with us, I'm here, Bowie's here, and we'd love to hear your story. But additionally, we have some resources that might be able to help you. And lastly, because I have to say this, if you are in a situation where this is challenging you so much, please contact the appropriate mental health charities or the Samaritans.
That's superbly put, Fergs. And may I say so that what we try and do in the Black Spy podcast is inform. We try and explain to you the way the world works, what happens, why it happens, and who may or may not be involved in that process and procedure. So if you're not particularly a contractor to whom this is happening, but you are somebody to whom this is happening in a different format, and I mentioned earlier on that this can happen with bankruptcies, this can happen where somebody else buys out your debt, this can happen with people who've been gambling and somebody else can buy out your debt, etc., etc. And if you know anybody who's suffering or has suffered this type of situation, but it's not you, please do pass them the podcast. Let them listen to what's being said. Let them understand how a lot of these things are interconnected with different parts of the system. And maybe even contact Furgas, where she can potentially help you or signpost you to the right particular place. And, you can then move forward on your particular issue if it's like this issue but not exactly the same, because I'm very familiar with this buying out of loans. People have spoken about it, and it seems to be one of those very grey areas that people are caught up in and can't really get out of. And as I've said to you, something as simple as you bought your holiday home in, I don't know, Florida or something, and you're now in it not for in perpetuity, really, not just your life, for the life of your family. You want to get out. These are the things that happen with civil contracting. And I hope that the show's been able to aid in giving you some understanding of how you potentially might be able to deal with that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. And hopefully we will have you, or you will listen to the show again next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.